Greetings, shining bulls and shining bears, and welcome to the 22nd episode of the Crypto Astrology Podcast. We are going to take a look at what this week holds for Bitcoin and Ether price. But first, please always feel welcome to check out the Shining Bull website, where I have all kinds of offerings for all suns, especially a trading signal service for day traders, a weekly forecast for both swing and day traders, which by the way gives price points, and the weekly forecast itself gives a lot of very important time frames actually for bullish and bearish moves for Bitcoin and Ether on a daily basis, in fact. Anyway, and of course I also offer predictive books and book bundle deals. I especially recommend my Bitcoin by 2026 and Ethereum by 2026 books. This is an important time to understand what the coming years will bring for Bitcoin and Ether, and these books are valuable. And in any case, if nothing's within your price range, just follow me on Twitter and make sure to get notifications for this podcast, as I give a lot of free info out right here. Now let's take a look at this week in Bitcoin and Ether price. And although I, the astrologer, live in Newfoundland, I am giving the weekly predictions that I make on this podcast as per UTC time. So first, Sunday UTC. Sunday UTC begins with Moon transiting in Pushya Nakshatra in the sign of Cancer. Around 1 a.m., green candles begin on the 2-hour chart due to decisions being made in government regarding financial products. When Moon joins Jupiter in Virgo in the Navamsha, where Sun and Mercury transit together in the sky. Right around noon, there is either a pullback or a downward move when Moon reaches Mercury's cuspal degree, right when Mars moves into Scorpio in the Navamsha. Next, beginning on Sunday night UTC, when Moon enters into Ashlesha Nakshatra in Cancer, there is some kind of investigation taking place, and if it influences prices, in the case that this influences prices, it will likely create a gradual upward movement. Next, Monday UTC. Monday UTC, Moon transits Ashlesha Nakshatra in Cancer. Around 4 a.m. UTC on Monday, there is likely to be a fake-out move, deceptive move, when Moon enters into the Capricorn Pada of Ashlesha. However, around 11 a.m., a more significant upward movement for Bitcoin specifically happens when Moon enters the Aquarius Pada of Ashlesha. But for ETH, this same movement of the Moon is likely to create a drop into a downward correction. Then, in the early evening, when Moon enters the final Pisces Pada of Ashlesha, I see a downward correction for both Bitcoin and Ether. Tuesday, UTC. Right after midnight on Monday, the ETH price chart leads Bitcoin price with strong green candles up when Moon enters Leo in the sky. There is a drop around 6 a.m. UTC when Venus reaches exact opposition to retrograding Saturn in the sky. But soon after, around 8 a.m. UTC, Moon enters into opposition to Saturn, and this creates the onset of a sustained price climb of green candles. A sudden change in direction then happens around 2 p.m. UTC, when Moon reaches the exact opposition to retrograding Saturn, and this can become visible on the daily chart too. Wednesday UTC. When Moon enters Purva Phalguni Nakshatra in the heart of Leo, around 3 a.m. UTC on Wednesday, green candles begin, which turn the daily candle green. The ascent continues as Moon enters into trine to retrograding Jupiter around 9 a.m., taking us through to around 9 p.m. So throughout the day, when Moon enters which is when Moon will exit the trine to retrograding Jupiter. And then at that point, strong red candles start. So strong red candles start at 9 p.m., but there should be strong green candles from 9 a.m. all the way through to 9 p.m. But as an extra note to traders should be aware of a sudden and surprising punctual move at around 5 p.m. when Moon joins Ketu in Libra in the Navamsha. This move is always difficult to predict, but it can be a surprising drop that happens in the midst of the larger green candle climate of the day. Thursday, UTC. A fascinating scenario begins to unfold around 6 a.m. UTC on Thursday when Moon enters into Uttara Phalguni Nakshatra, showing me a particular important decision that can propel Bitcoin and Ether prices upward. The upward momentum gains a solid footing around midday or early afternoon UTC when Moon enters into the sign of Virgo. Friday, UTC. Friday, I see a volatile drop around breakfast UTC when Moon enters Hasta Nakshatra. But right around noon UTC, when Mars reaches exact trine to retrograding Saturn, I see an explosive upward movement of many strong green candles. Lastly, Saturday UTC. I see an intense moment happening for Gary Gensler specifically. During breakfast time on Saturday UTC, when Moon reaches Mercury in the sky, something significant is revealed. A few hours later, around 11 a.m. UTC, an up move starts when Moon enters Chitra, joining Sun in Leo in the Navamsha. I see that prices keep moving up, but at the onset of the evening, when the new moon, which is also an eclipse, is exact, I see a troubling geopolitical scenario regarding leaders of countries, and I see a drop. And then, very surprisingly and very importantly, I see that Bitcoin price specifically can be sent up with powerful green candles emerging on the Bitcoin price chart close to midnight on Saturday, UTC, and that this upswing is motivated directly by a larger geopolitical event. And this happens when Moon enters Libra, initiating an immediate transit of Ketu. Again, if you want price points and more information on exact time frames, then get my weekly forecast, which you can buy on the website, because that gives a lot more detail with price points. So now let's talk about the news from the past week. Again, although I, the astrologer, am physically located in Newfoundland, I'm referencing UTC time as opposed to my time zone here. So, on Monday, October 2nd, shortly after Venus re-entered Leo, he began transiting Ethereum's natal Jupiter, and this transit coincided precisely with Monday's launch of ETH futures ETFs. This event not only marked the beginning of a heightened volatility for ETH price, evidenced by a notable drop on the same day, Monday, which persisted in the days that followed, but it was unique to ETH, as the next day, Tuesday, saw Bitcoin commencing a recovery trajectory up while ETH price continued downward. The transit of Venus across Ethereum's natal Jupiter was exact in the early hours of Friday, October 6th UTC, and brought the first green candle on the ETH daily chart since the downturn initiated on Monday. Previously, in an article and podcast episode, that was episode 8 of this podcast, shared at the very beginning of July, I outlined the astrological significance of Rahu's transit through Aries, which is Ethereum's 6th house, and its implications on Ethereum. This transit amplifies adversarial forces, but it also aids in vanquishing them. So I also touched at that time on the unveiling of the CME Ether Bitcoin ratio futures, which had just launched at the time, mentioning that it was a new avenue for price manipulation by way of traditional finance products. Around late June and early July, Mars, the ruler of Aries where Rahu transits, approached Ethereum's natal Jupiter and Venus, activating Rahu's tactical maneuvers to safeguard Ethereum's future, introducing new risks aimed at neutralizing future threats during his transit through the 6th house. In the past week now, we observed the adverse impact of the new ETH futures products on Ether price, while the launch of these ETFs simultaneously showed a positive endorsement for Ethereum itself, especially evident from, for example, the fund Van Eck's enthusiastic commitment on Twitter to donating a portion of its ETF profits to contributors of the Ethereum protocol in order to further Ethereum's own unique trajectory in the world. So, there you see an example of exactly what I had been speaking about in early July, about Rahu causing initial distress, in this case evidenced by the ETH price volatility, but in order to create a better situation. So it's like and it introduces distress and then it makes things better also. So, but there was another important illustration of the effects of Rahu's transit in Ethereum's 6th house. The preceding weekend to the ETH futures launch on Saturday, September 30th, Vitalik Buterin wrote a blog post advocating for diversification amongst staking pool operators to mitigate potential systemic risk, and he specifically mentioned Rocket Pool and Lido. Rahu is nearing the end of his transit in Ethereum's 6th house, and when planets such as Rahu end their transit in a given sign, it is usually like a final stamp or seal punctuating the work that he has been doing in that sign. And that's usually when you realize the essence, the reason, what that planet was doing for you in that given sign at the very end, a planet like Rahu, for example. So the same thing will happen with Jupiter, for example. Okay, this means that at this very moment, right now, the Ethereum community should be especially vigilant of any potential looming threats like Lido, and from my own astrological standpoint, my opinion as an astrologer, Eigenlayer, and to act preemptively to avert potential future disaster right now. Why? Because right now is when Rahu is finishing his transit in Ethereum's 6th house. Rahu is going to shift end of this month, and you notice that right now is when Vitalik published this blog post. So that's what I wanted to say. And also just about this week ahead, as I mentioned, at the end of this week we have the eclipse. I typically do not like to speak on eclipses, but and eclipses are very difficult to predict because their essence is that it's very difficult to see exactly what's going to happen on an eclipse, because the eclipse has its own dynamism that is very strong, and I typically don't like to talk about it, but I do see that. So like I said, this week it's like it's leading up to the end of the week where the eclipse happens, and because the eclipse happens and then moon enters into Libra, which is where sun is going to be entering some days later, and then as I mentioned in the 2023 predictions books, just look at those. When sun enters Libra, it's going to create some situation of immense volatility. But since at the end of this week, the eclipse happens and then moon enters Libra, I see that something is coming out. I see two things. One is that the transits that are happening this week are happening right on Gary Gensler's natal chart, some important points in his chart. And so on one hand, I see something is coming up with Gary Gensler that is going to influence price, but I'm not sure how much that's actually going to influence price. But then at the very end of this week, unrelated to that, so this is no longer talking about Gensler, something big, like geopolitically related to leaders, can come to the forefront, and that can definitely be very powerful for Bitcoin specifically. And finally, just to say that because this eclipse is happening right before Sun enters into Libra, which is where Sun is debilitated, and because when Sun enters into Libra, Sun is entering into conjunction with Ketu and Mars, I would say all leaders of countries have to be very cautious and have like increased, I don't know, security and be very careful. And anybody who leads a company, anybody who's in charge of like a CEO, leader of a company, those people don't need to be careful like that, but they just have to be very nimble and flexible and on their toes at that time to make fast decisions so that they can do what's right and lead properly, because it's a tricky moment. So, but especially I see important political leaders should be very careful, really careful. Okay, thank you, and I will see you next week.